I just want to acknowledge the tribal people of the area, Turrbal and Yagara people, and I pay my respects to my elders, past, present. I want to acknowledge Auntie Jean and the other elders here, Uncle Dave, and it's good to be here. I identify myself as a Garawa and Bachelor man, and when we come into another country, we identify who we are, and it's like you rock up to someone's house, you knock on the door, and you don't just walk into someone's house, you've got to identify who you are. So today if someone knocked on your door, they said, I'm from Avon, I want to sell you stuff, you tell them to go. So if I come with the wrong intention, we have to speak that out and say that we come with good intentions, and then before we come into someone else's country, we just show our respects that way. So thank you. I'm going to hand it over to young Layla.
Thanks, Sammy. Ladies and gentlemen, and can I ask you just to show your acknowledgement and thanks to Sammy Without going into the formalities myself, I'd like to now introduce Lila. Lila's one of our grade 8 students at All Hallows. Lila, some of you were here last year. Lila did her acknowledgement of country on behalf of the school last year. Thank you, Lila, for opening today, really.
Good morning. My name is Lila Hannon, and I'm in Year 8 here at Hallows School. I'm a direct descendant of the Turrbal people whose land we meet on today. In fact, just 7 generations ago, my grandfather had his camp at what is now known as Victoria Park. I also have cultural connections to Gubbi Gubbi and Darrinbal nations along the eastern coast of Queensland. On behalf of my family, All Hallows School and everyone here, I'd like to formally acknowledge the traditional owners of this land in Brisbane, the Turrbal and Yagara people. We pay respect to their ancestors, those who have walked and cared for this land for thousands of years. We acknowledge their descendants who maintain these spiritual connections, and we give thanks to those who continue to travel the dreaming pathways. Thank you, Mr. Wall, for inviting me here this morning, and I'd like to extend a special thank you to Professor Reynolds for the profound impact that you have made and continue to make in truth-telling of Australia's history. Finally, to elders past, present and emerging, we'd like to thank them for the wisdom that they've passed on to all of us in various ways. May we hold this in trust as we work together to build a united and culturally confident Australia. Thank you.
Thanks, Lila. I think I've got a terribly difficult job today. I'm the person on the other end of the emails. I'm Vince Wall, if I've not met you. Please introduce yourself to me during the course of the day so I can forget your name and apologise another time. But thank you so much for coming along and supporting us. It's a fairly significant event to have someone of Professor Reynolds' ilk with us today. I cannot do anywhere near the quality of job that Lila has done as the voice of the next generation. Very, very proud of the work you've done, Lila. Thank you so much for acknowledging country on behalf of the school and all of us here. Beautiful job. I'm going to go with the easy job. I've already heard that there is a password query about the password there for history. So after I've done the formalities here, I'll sneak out of the room for a moment. And Mr. Corbett?
It is still history, but all lowercase.
All lowercase. So the error is that that's been written in uppercase for you. So if you're trying to get onto the school Wi-Fi with the free password, it's history, all lowercase. That's a good fix. Fire evacuation. We gather on what's called the terrace. Now the terrace is a big grass area on the other side of this building behind us. So if we do have an emergency evacuation at all during the day today, hopefully we won't, that's where we'll head out. But there's quite a number of All Hallows teachers here who will guide you in that direction, as will some of our students who know that very, very well. Bathrooms are to your right over on the side there. Before we go too much further into today, can I just ask, we're really happy for photographs and tweets and social media sharing and so on. A couple of things. What we probably really love to avoid is phone calls coming in. So can you check your ringtones, turn off notifications on certain apps and so on. Just have a bit of a check over those elements. Something we really are keen to do is recognise that today is put on by All Hallows as part of our professional learning program. That's a program where we want to have some outreach into the community. We're very, very aware of the privileges we have in such a beautiful school. We can't redress every imbalance in Australian education, but something we can try and do is hold events like this at the lowest possible cost and share it. And that's what we'll be doing, videotaping. It'll go on the school YouTube channel. We'll circulate that address and hopefully we can share this far and wide to anyone who can't get there. In terms of money, there was actually a debate behind the scene. We did not want to charge money at all for you to come, but what we have found is if we don't charge some money, people don't turn up, they grab the ticket and don't come. So it was enough to basically cover a little bit of the food and a little bit around the edges, but it's a nominal charge. So when we hold events like this into the future, could I really ask you to bear some of those ideas in mind, that we are genuinely trying to, I guess, add to the conversation around all the issues of the frontier wars and reconciliation and so forth. There's an element of truth telling there. Now the hard bit. So I did some Googling, and because my issue was, Henry has been doing his research since the 1960s, which I don't want to go too far, but I thought I was getting on a bit, and this is longer than I've been alive. How am I going to introduce his body of work? So I thought I'll do what the kids do, because they're onto something. I'll Google this. Who's done it recently? And the most recent person I could find introducing I could steal ideas from was quite intimidating, because that was Philip Adams. And I thought, wow. So where do we start? Well, because this doesn't have to go through Turnitin, I thought I'll take a few of his ideas. But basically, I think what I need to do here is talk from the heart on a couple of ideas here and pick up on some of the main elements of Professor Reynolds' contribution. My first thought coming into this was the idea of disruption. Something that we're all aware of. We're in an age of digital disruption. We can share information in ways that we've never done before, and we can disturb the way people think. And so then I go back and look at Professor Reynolds' life and think, okay, in 1966-67, Professor Reynolds and his wife Margaret are in Townsville in the lead up to the 1967 referendum, and they were activists at that time. Now if we look at how that changed the way people think, that's a fairly significant moment of disruption. So that was my first thought. There's decades of books, decades of teaching behind Professor Reynolds here. I am rereading The Other Side of the Frontier at the moment. I've also got my next one on the pile is Why Weren't We Told? These are incredibly influential, disruptive pieces of writing. I don't think I'm exaggerated. I know there's some big names out there, but Professor Reynolds is perhaps the most influential and profound historian in Australian history. The changes that he has brought in our nation have been phenomenal through the power of ideas and disruptive ideas. He's challenged conventional thinking on so many issues. The conversations he has had and the work he's done has changed laws. And when I'm saying laws, the whole concept of title, of land ownership in Australia does connect very directly to Professor Reynolds. He's reshaped the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Australia more than we can even imagine. I expect historians of the future will be studying the contributions of Professor Reynolds, and I think that's an enormous compliment. I said to Professor Reynolds last night I couldn't list every journal article, every book, and I think the fact that you're all here, you probably know these contributions, but it is worth reflecting on. Currently, I think my best understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, Henry is Honorary Professor of Research at the University of Tasmania. He spent many years at James Cook University. Henry has been in a previous life a history teacher, not at university level, at school level in England. He's born and raised in Tasmania. He's taught in schools very different to the type of school I'm in London's East End. He knew the Mabo family when their kids were in kindy. I think at this stage I need to basically get out of the road and turn you over to the enormous contributions hopefully Henry Reynolds can make to us in our classrooms. Please welcome Henry Reynolds.
Well, thank you. Is that on? You hearing me? Thank you so much for that welcome to country, to the school and Queensland. I used to be a Queenslander for a long, long time, or perhaps more correctly, a North Queenslander.
Excuse me, Henry, I'm going to interject already. I'm not sure you're on.
No, that's what I thought.
Okay. Want to do a sound check?
No.
No, you don't. That looks much more promising. Okay, Carl has walked away. Yeah. How about we start and Carl will turn up and make sure we're live for sound. That's good for future post. Yeah, I think we've got a red flashing light, which is never a good sign. Henry, you start. You'll get Carl in a moment.
I'll just use a big voice. It's very nice to be welcomed. As I say, I lived in North Queensland for more than 30 years. Not that people thought I was much of a North Queenslander, as I didn't drink much Forex, I didn't drink any Bundy, and I wasn't interested in rugby. And I went to North Queensland almost by chance. It was almost an accident. I was teaching in London with Margaret, and out of the blue I was offered a job in a place called Townsville. And I hadn't applied for that job. And I won't go into detail, but for a variety of reasons they had to get someone quickly, and I'd been on a short list for a job in Brisbane, which I didn't get, and suddenly I got a telegram that I had to go into the City of London to interview a person, and 4 or 5 days later I was offered a job in Townsville. Now, in the days when you couldn't you couldn't look up things on your phone, I wasn't exactly sure where Townsville was. I knew it was one of those provincial cities up the coast, but it was much farther up the coast than I imagined. And so I accepted this job without really knowing much about North Queensland or Townsville. And so I arrived at a most interesting time. Now, it was indeed just the period when people were campaigning for the referendum, and we became very involved in that campaign. But it was also an interesting time for the whole question of I'll use the term race relations. It's not a term that I particularly like, but at least it is a shorthand. It was a very interesting time because what was happening was what I call the reurbanisation of Indigenous Australians. Now, by that I mean that in the 19th century, Aboriginal people were in and around all the towns in Queensland, and certainly in the big towns like Cairns and Townsville. And in the early 20th century, you had what has to be called the internal white Australia policy where people were increasingly pushed out of the towns. And so by the 1950s, there would have been very, very few Aborigines and Islanders actually living in the towns. But by 1966, it was all changing. The Torres Strait Islanders, who hadn't been allowed onto mainland Australia, had come, the young men had come to build the railway to Townsville, Mount Isa. And they'd stayed on and were beginning to bring their families, get married and have children. And for the first time, there was a significant Torres Strait Islander urban population. In terms of the Aboriginal population, this was just the time when the Queensland government brought in reforms, and for the first time people could just leave the reserve if they wanted. And so Palm Island in particular was a very big reserve, and people started coming to live in Townsville. And at the same time, changes in the pastoral industry, including equal pay, meant that many, many people were being pushed off the pastoral stations and coming into the towns. So it was a rapidly changing situation to which people in many ways were reacting violently. And we walked into the middle of this, knowing nothing about it. Now, one incident, I guess, talk about many, many things, because we used to spend almost every day somewhere in and around the town, or, in Townsville, just in the street. There's only one street in Townsville. Margaret was pushing our little, first child, about 2, in a pusher, up Lower Flinders Street, and it was about 10 o'clock, and in those days it was amazing how full the pubs were at 10 o'clock in the morning. It seemed to be a tropical thing to do. And suddenly, out of the swing doors that they had in the pubs in those days, a black man came hurtling out and hit his head on the veranda post and was lying there bleeding. He'd been thrown out. It all happened just in front of them. And my little boy said, "Oh, poor man, poor man." And Margaret stopped and locked the pram and rushed into the pub. A Sheila in the bar, this was astonishing. And she said, "Quick, quick, quick, this man's been badly hurt." And the barman said, "Hey fellas, this here Sheila wants us to help the black guy, help the nigger." So she walked out. She no mobile phone, so she hurried up to the post office and rang the public phone and rang the ambulance and said, "Quick, quick, there's a man lying in Flinders Street and he's badly hurt." And the ambulance said, is he a black? No, yeah. Oh, he's probably just drunk. And then she rang the police, and they too were very reluctant. They may well have come, but of course how they treated the poor man was anyone's guess. Now that, in a way, was an indication of a world that we knew nothing about. Now, whereas Margaret was the activist who constantly, drew me into this life, particularly by beginning kindergarten Head Start, which is still going. It was the first kindergarten for, Indigenous kids, and not all Aboriginal Islanders, but also some white kids. She drew me into the community, but my job was to teach history. I was told I had to teach Australian history, which in a way I didn't want to do. I'd done no Australian history, and the University of Tasmania at that stage didn't teach Australian history, although I'd done an MA. But I didn't know that much about history, and I'd just come back from Europe, my head was full of the Renaissance, and I wanted to teach European history. But they said, no, we're already doing it, you've got to teach Australian history. So I had to very quickly read enough to be able to teach Australian history to 2 small classes. My students were all North Queenslanders, either by birth or by occupation. They all knew about their society far more than I did. And there were 2 things I noted about the history I was expected to teach. Now, one was that there was nothing about North Queensland. it was provincial Australia, and everything happened down south. Some of it in Brisbane, but mainly in Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra. So I had to begin by putting some local history into the course. But the big thing was there was absolutely nothing about race. Now, if I'd been doing this teaching elsewhere, I may not have realised, this may not have struck me so dramatically. But I knew on a daily basis that this was very important, and everyone knew it was important, and my students knew it was important, because many of them had come from smaller towns, had come from, some of them were from pastoral stations, some of them, their parents taught in Aboriginal communities, so they knew this was very important. So I quickly decided I had to do something about it. Now remember, this was the time when there was, as the famous anthropologist Bill Stanner said, when Australia, this was a time of the Great Australian Silence. That famous phrase was coined in 1968, right at the time when I was wrestling with this problem. And the leading historian, Professor at ANU at the time, had written a survey of Australian history over 30 years. He said, well, unlike other countries like New Zealand and Canada, and South Africa, we don't notice the Aboriginal people. They only appear in our history, wait for it, as a melancholy anthropological footnote. Now the other thing was that our course was being run from Brisbane, and I was given the textbook that I was to use, and it was called Australia, A Social and Political History. And it was edited by a man called Gordon Greenwood, who was a very important man in Queensland. He was the professor of both history and political science at UQ. And he and 6 other authors had produced this book, and it was the most important history book at the time. That is, over 20 years, between 1955 and 1974, it was reprinted 13 times. And in many ways, it was a good book. But there was nothing about Aborigines, not a thing. They didn't even appear in the index. Now, because I was living where I was, realised there's something terribly wrong with this. And so I looked up all the reviews of it. Now, if you weren't in that book as one of the chapter writers, then you probably reviewed it. And I read all the reviews I could find, about 6 of them, and not one of the reviewers thought there was anything wrong with this. So it was an extraordinary moment, as I say, the two things, going and living in North Queensland at this time and teaching history, which simply had left the Aborigines out completely. It was as though they didn't exist. So if there's one thing that I think you can say is that quite by chance, I led a change which meant that the history, particularly of Queensland, but particularly of the North, brought about a revolution in general Australian history. It was the revolt of the North. And of course, when it came to Mabo and Wick, it was also a legal revolt. So Greenwood, as I say, Greenwood, I didn't go and tell the great professor, what's the matter with your history? There's nothing about Aborigines in it. I was much too frightened of a big, intimidating, red-faced Queensland man. But one of, as I say, so what was I to do? You know, where could I find out about Aborigines in Australian history so I could change my teaching? And it was my teaching that was my first consideration. I didn't know that I was going to then end up writing book after book after book on the subject. So I needed to change my teaching to make it relevant to my students. And the little library at Townsville University College was very small. It hadn't really had a foundation library, and there weren't many books. And there certainly wasn't anything about Queensland and Aborigines in Queensland, but I did come across a book called Triumph in the Tropics. Some of you may know of it, published in 1959, and it was the centenary history of Queensland, and it was written by Sir Raphael Salento and Clem Lack. But when you looked up what was said about the Aborigines, you thought, well, maybe silence was better than what they were writing. Let me just give you a quote. It is usual to assess the Aboriginals by comparison with mature or indeed primitive civilisations, but they must be considered as nomads of the jungle or savanna or desert, comparable with the animal groups that inhabited those areas, for which they felt an affinity. If their reactions are estimated along these lines, they became logical and understandable. Like other nomadic food gatherers, the Aboriginal ignored what he did not comprehend or showed indifference, rather than astonishment, when faced with something he failed to classify among his schedules of experiences. Listen to this bit. Like his own half-wild dogs, he could be frozen to shivering immobility, or put to frenzied flight by people or things that provoked impressions of terror. Like his dogs too, he could be cowed by a direct and confident stare into a wary armed troops, but would probably attack with fury if an opponent showed signs of fear. These are primitive reactions common to many feral jungle creatures and not uncommon to higher races. Now that was the official centenary history of Queensland in 1959 by Sir Raphael, one of the great men of the state. So there was a long way to go to change the history. So what I had to do was to begin research. You know, if there'd been plenty of books there, I may not have done this research. But I had to go and do the basic research because there was nothing there. And there wasn't much around. One of the only interesting sources available in North Queensland was that in Bowen there was a full run of the Port Denison Times that started in 1861 or 2, the oldest paper in North Queensland. And the big copies were still there. And so down to Bowen, read these great big newspapers. And that really was astonishing. As I said before, the violence just spilled out of the pages. Everyone was aware. It's not that it's not at that time that people didn't know it and talk about it. They talked about it constantly. And there were quite serious debates of the sort that people found disturbing 100 years later. And as one said, we all know that the foundations of our community were cemented in blood. So there was a realism about the 19th century that got lost. And so in so many ways, that's where I began. And partly because I decided not to do a PhD, I didn't have to chain myself to one small topic. I then went researching for the next 10 years all over Australia, you know, and funded by the university. Went everywhere. Every library and every archive all over the country, and including going to Britain where there was also lots of material. And then eventually this, the product of this 10 years work was the other side of the frontier. Now, a lot of people, I think, may have got the impression that this was something dashed off, ill-considered, not backed with research. But indeed, that was clearly not the case. Let me just give you an indication of the work that this was involved. Now, I was looking the other day at my list of sources. There were 300 books or articles, there were 70 theses, there were 82 parliamentary papers, and there were 60 newspapers. Now that's without the unpublished material in archives around the country. So this was the distillation of an enormous amount of work. And that, in a way, was my response to the silence and my response as a North Queenslander to the way history was being written. It was, as I say, in a way, it was my response to the way history had not just left the Aborigines out, but if you left the Aborigines out, you could say it was a very peaceful history. And they did, again and again and again. Australia was had a uniquely peaceful history. Well, if you left the Aborigines out, yes, you know, you read the stockade, a few bush rangers and a few people killed in strikes, you could say it was very peaceful. But if you brought the Aborigines back in, the Indigenous people back in, it changed everything. You couldn't just put them in a sort of lean-to out the back of the historical building. You had to completely redesign the building itself. And in a way, I wanted quite specifically to tell the story from Australia looking out, not from the British looking in. And as I say, hence the book. Well now, I want to move on, and having explained why I turned up in North Queensland in 1966, what I was doing there, how with Margaret we got deeply involved in the life of the community, deeply involved in activism, meeting many people who later became important. I mean, at that stage, Harry Penrith was there, Bobby Sykes, of course, had grown up in Townsville, and Eddie Mabo, who had recently come from the Torres Strait. And so it was a very interesting mix. And so I then continued because the violence of the frontier, well, there was so much material about it and it was so compelling, the frontier became the theme of other books that I'd written. I mean, Frontier with the White People was whispering in our hearts. But I also got interested in law. Now, I knew nothing about law, but the land rights movement, in particular, as I'll explain in a moment, my involvement with Eddie Mabo, once again, as I had known nothing about the history, I had to go and do the research. I had to go and do research about the law. And so I had a fellowship in Canberra, and I spent weeks and weeks, months, in a library in the High Court. It was called the Practitioners' Library. No one was there because the High Court wasn't sitting. This beautiful library with beautiful furniture looking down into the lake, and every conceivable statute and book about the law on open shelves. So I just read everything and gave myself an education in the law. I must admit, I constantly fear that someone's going to say, but you don't know about such and such. That is something that people had learned in first year law, because I'd never done. I became a bush lawyer. I didn't, many things I didn't know, but I did know a lot about this aspect of the law, and hence I wrote the book, The Law of the Land. Historians dismissed it. Oh, what is this young tiger know about the law? But the lawyers didn't. The lawyers knew it was a sound book, and it was set as a first-year book in law courses. But this raises that question of how I got involved in the land rights movement. Now, land rights was becoming an issue, and it was an issue in Townsville. But it was, of course, the critical thing was when I discussed this question with Eddie Mabo. Now, I've known Eddie for a long time, and I've known him in all sorts of different areas. And, you know, we knew their family. Their kids had gone to Margaret's kindergarten. We'd been involved together in the referendum, etc., etc. So he came to work at the university at this stage, and we used to have lunch together. Our sandwiches in little brown paper bags. And he was very keen to talk about growing up on Murray Island. Murray Islands, Murray and Darnley, way up there, almost up to Papua, with a culture that was more Melanesian than Aboriginal, both linguistically and every other way. And he'd been involved with all these causes. He knew many Aboriginal people. He'd been in the Aboriginal Advancement League, but he didn't imagine that the land rights had anything to do with him personally, because he was so confident that his island was owned by the islanders. I mean, they had almost no white fellas ever there, apart from the school teacher. They ran their own affairs. His family had owned the same land for generations, and everyone knew it was their land. And so once I said, and he was in town, but he wasn't allowed to go back to Murray Island. They wouldn't let him for years and years and years, because, you know, he was a communist, he was a ratbag, you know, he was mixing with the wrong sort of people down there in Townsville. And so I said to him once, I said, you know, how do you know your land will still be there for you when you eventually go back? He said, oh, everyone knows it's Mabo land. Well, I thought about that, and I realised he had no idea whatsoever that the land wasn't his, that it was Crown land. And so I said to my PhD student, Noel Luce, who was working on the thesis, which became that book that's reprinted out there, I said, do you think we should tell him? And Noel, we talked about this and we decided that we had to. And so the next lunch or the one after, I said, Eddie, look, I don't want to tell you this, but do you realise that the land isn't yours? You don't own it at all, it's all Crown land. And he was aghast. But he knew, he trusted me and realised if I was saying that it was true, and that his self-confidence of being an islander, having his land, Murray and Darnley was the homeland, just went like that. Now, that is where the Mabo case began from. Now, one other thing where I was influential was that I realised that I'd done American history and that there were court cases in America, famous court cases in the 19th century, which defined a thing called Indian title, native title in other words. And so I said to him, look, you know, I reckon you could take this to court. I think you might win a court case over this, on the assumption that it would be easier for him to prove ownership than Aboriginal people, because, you know, according to in the way that Europeans saw it. And so that is the second thing. And so when he eventually met some good lawyers who know something about land rights, because the university students in Townsville had arranged a conference, that was where the course began, which profoundly changed the land law in Australia for the first time in 200 years. And then, of course, the Wick case came, but I was deeply involved in that, but I won't go into the detail about that. So, as I say, I was almost propelled into writing these things by the consequence of coming from far south of Australia, knowing nothing about these things, finding aspects of Australian history or Australian society I knew nothing about and was deeply shocked by it, because it changed my view of Australia completely and permanently. it was a very different place to what I imagined. And the Australia I've grown up in. And also, from there we moved on to the law. And both the history and the law, I think, ended up being dramatically changed as a consequence. Well, let me go back to Queensland. Now, as I say, the work about the frontier conflict became very controversial, as many of you will know. There was the history wars, the argument that people like me had fabricated all of this, we'd made it up. Some of those wonderful writers in the Australian said that I'd told lies, and Janet Albrechtson, figures I think she said. John Howard in particular in 1996 came to power with a determination to attack what he called the black arm view of history. And he was quite serious about this. It was important to him. He felt that the black arm view of history was undermining young Australians' pride in their country. And there may have been some truth in that. And above all, people were deeply disturbed because we were recovering a sort of history that had been apparent to everyone in the 19th century and plopping it down in the middle of the 20th century. When 2 generations of Australians had been brought up on this nice, benign story about peaceful pioneering. And suddenly these young troublemakers were saying, but look over there. Look, it's not all nice. What about frontier violence? What about conflict? What about killing? And it doesn't surprise me that many people, particularly older people, found this deeply disturbing, because we were saying what you were told about Australian history is simply not true. You've been told, you've been given a great deal of mythology. And of course it has continued into the present. It is still far more acceptable now, but undoubtedly these ideas are still there in the ongoing history wars. And one of the major demands of the Uluru Statement, indeed, was truth-telling. So it remains a very, very significant question, which brings me back to Queensland. Now, I haven't done much fresh research on Queensland since what I did many years ago, but there have been all sorts of very, very good scholarship from people like Ray Evans and Robert Jensen and Jonathan Richards and Timothy Bottoms and Libby Connors and Ray Kirkhope here, so that there is now better scholarship about Queensland than almost anywhere else in Australia. And this just reminds us that there is, what I say, a real problem with Queensland. Let me explain why. Now, I suppose the most obvious thing is the amount of violence. Now, there's nowhere in Australia that didn't see fighting and frontier conflict. Australia, as people haven't realised until very recently, Australia was made up of many, many small nations who had their own language, their own traditions, their own culture, and who preserved their boundaries over generations. I mean, in Tasmania, because they're straight-blooded, something like 350, 400 generations preserved those 9 national boundaries. They didn't become one people over 300 generations. Relatively small place. They didn't become one people. They didn't become 3 or 5. The original 9 remained, and when the British arrived, they were there with their own languages and their own traditions. Now, everywhere where the Europeans pushed in, each of their nations fought and resisted in their own way. So it's a complex story. But in Queensland, there were some quite distinctive things. Now, one was that in 1859, when Queensland got self-government, 5 years after New South Wales, it did mean that for the first time, the colonists themselves were in control of government, and the Imperial British government simply withdrew and basically left the Indigenous people to be dealt with by the settlers, the colonists, as they decided. And it's very certainly arguable that for the Indigenous Australians that was a disaster, because the Imperial government was more concerned about their future than the colonists themselves. And remember, Queensland, when they got self-government, they occupied just a very, very small part of the state, with the colony in the southeast corner. They'd only recently got up into the Darling Downs, but only slowly moving north. So the great spread of Queensland was untouched in the sense of the colonists, the settlers, the invaders, whatever you want to use. And it was a population that was still very largely intact. I don't think there was any smallpox in Queensland, which cycled through the population of New South Wales and Victoria. And as you got into the tropics, the population densities were almost certainly higher. So this was the one place where you had the colonists, the settlers, moving out into Aboriginal country over a long, long period of time. And remember, what drove this along was the Queensland Native Police. For 50 years they patrolled the frontier. And their instructions were to disperse any large gathering of Aborigines. Now, one of the great, most contentious things is how many people were killed in this process. Well, we can tell you how many Europeans were killed. Almost, you might miss a few. But no one can be sure about this. Now, when I was riding the other side of the frontier, I felt I was being very, very brave by putting a figure on the number of people killed in the frontier wars. I said 20,000, at least 20,000. Now, that stood for a long time, but in particular the work in Queensland now suggests that's far too small. And in particular the work of Ray Evans and Robert Jensen argue that it was much greater than this. And this becomes significant because it matches the death rate in the wars. Not the little wars, the big wars, First and Second World War. So that matters because we are so determined not to forget those who fell, as we talk about, those who fell. 60,000 plus in the First World War. Monuments in every small town. War memorial. We spent hundreds of millions of dollars commemorating the war dead. The First World War. We spent $100 million on a museum in northern France. So what do we do about 60,000 being killed, many of them in Queensland? It is a real problem to know what to deal with. And it's something. The other point is that this was all illegal. Now there were two laws which in a way were totally, and Australians are so happy to talk about the rule of law. We inherit the rule of law from Britain, etc., etc. But one, it was illegal to force Aboriginal people off their country under pastoral leases, which had been designed in Britain, but which imposed, that law was imposed on Australia, and of course it was discovered to be still operational in the whip judgment. But that was there all the time when they were pushing people off country. It was illegal. It was against the law to do that. It was also illegal to just kill people. Now remember, it wasn't a case where they had a warrant for someone's arrest. They go out and they arrest the person, and they bring the person in, and there's a trial, and they're found guilty, and then they're convicted, you know, they're convicted and then punished. It's simply going out and killing people. Now that was murder. Or if it wasn't, and this is the critical thing, if it wasn't murder, was it war? And it's a choice Australians don't want to make. They don't like, they rear up when you say there was all of this murder, and you go, well, let's call it war. We don't say that the Australians murdered tens of thousands of Germans in the First World War. We say they were killed in war. So do we have to say it was warfare? And that's one of those questions which hasn't been dealt with at all. And this brings me to my final point, but of great significance in relation to this question. At the moment, in many parts of the world, there's a real thinking about the historical record and about how you remember it and commemorate it. Now, I was in America a few years ago. My daughter lives in New York. When the great debate came about what you do about Confederate monuments, what you do about all the monuments in the South about the people who fought to defend slavery. And as you know, in some places they're pulling monuments down. And they're doing the same in South America. They're pulling down the statues of Columbus and replacing Columbus with an Indigenous person. That is Columbus Day, which I've just had. Columbus Day is increasingly in North and South America being replaced by Indigenous Americans Day. So there's a great deal of not just thinking, but how you then practically deal with that. And I noticed too, this last year, they opened what apparently is a very, very incredibly innovative, moving monument in Alabama to the victims of lynching. Now, in a way, lynching is rather like what happened in Queensland at much the same time. The height of lynching was in the 1880s and 1890s, when hundreds of mainly black men, but not always, were lynched. That is, there was American law, and then there was lynching. And everyone accepted that you could just lynch people, you could just kill them and torture them. And so they've got this very, very new monument about lynching. Now, what do we do about Australia in particular? And let me zero in on one person, and that is Samuel Walker Griffith. Now, he was Attorney General or Premier for 12 years between the 1870s and 1880s, 1890s. He therefore presided over the native police. That is, while he was in government, hundreds of Aboriginal Queenslanders were killed, if you like, were killed in battle or murdered. And yet, he was one of the greatest jurists in Australian history. He was the first Chief Justice, he was the Chief Justice of Queensland, and then the first Chief Justice of the High Court. He helped draft the Constitution. He was a great defender of the common law and the rule of law. Now, whereas many of the frontiersmen probably thought it was legal to kill Aborigines, just as the Southerners thought it was legal to lynch black people, Griffith certainly knew exactly that this was what they call extrajudicial killing. And And yet here we are with Griffith University. With Griffith, I just discovered this yesterday, Institute of Criminology. And they say they're among the most vibrant, I think I've got the quote, the most vibrant Institute of Criminology almost anywhere in the world. That's very big. So what do you do with this problem? And at the end of this week, the Griffith University has got a small conference that I found about one of those rare days I bought the Australian. Griffith University for tomorrow, integrity, and I've got the Griffith lecture, and the lecturer is a woman of great significance in terms of international law, talking about the application of law in violent situations. So this, as I say, brings us back. If you say, well, yes, we've got to bring back the whole story into our history, it changes the law, it changes the way people are taught about Australian history. We're now at that stage where we have to think about, as you know, the Americans are very seriously. For instance, quite a number of the big universities, the old ones, are saying we really must resolve the way in which our university and the name that the university bears had involved in slavery. And there was a very strong movement to get rid of the name of Cecil Rhodes in both South Africa and England. Rhodes must go was a campaign. So, as I say, it raises that question. If we are to take truth-telling seriously, then we've got to think how we do that and how we truly remember it, and not actually commemorate it, but remember and come to terms with our own history. And one of the ways, clearly, I think, is there's no reason why in so many ways, what went wrong in Australia went wrong as a result of policy designed in Britain, not in Australia. After all, the idea that the Aborigines had no sovereignty and no land was decided in England, and no one in Australia could change it. So when people say, oh, we were so bad, well, yes, we were, but let's sheet home much of the blame on the government over there. And let's, for instance, ask the monarchy, the Queen, for an apology, as the Maoris got. And also, turn the story around. If we are going to make war, continue to make war central, let's make this our great war, and let's above all commemorate the heroes who were fighting to defend their country against an invader. And this is done in South America. I won't go on, I'll finish here. I was very interested when I was in Chile, and I walked up to these great big plazas, being Spanish heritage, in the middle of the city, and up in the middle of the plaza there's a great rock outcrop, and obviously people go up there, and right on top of this outcrop was the statue of an Indian. And so I asked Chilean people, who's the person up there? And they said, oh, no, I can't pronounce the name. That's so-and-so. He's our national hero. And I said, oh, there's an Indian. Yes, of course. He fought the Spaniards. And so he's our national hero. Now that doesn't mean necessarily that the Mapuche Indians, it's the main group, very large group of Indians, are treated better than Aborigines in Australia. But nonetheless, their national hero is the Indian who fought the Spaniards. Now that's because, and I said, well, how did you do that? They said, oh, because we fought the Spaniards too. And because they fought the Spaniards and just became an independent republic, they no longer had any sense that we have to identify with or with the Spaniards, the Spaniard imperialists. We are Chileans and the Indians are heroes because they fought for the freedom of our nation. Now that's the way I think it can be done. I don't think it's going to happen quickly, but that's the way I think you've got to basically understand and teach about the frontier wars and see it from that side of the frontier of people who suffered enormously. Now, for everything that Australians overseas suffered in war, they were, as I've said somewhere, and people will kill me for it, they had the luxury of fighting on other people's land. And no matter how much they suffered, they were sure that their families were safe, their houses were secure, their way of life was inviolate. Whereas Indigenous Australians were fighting on their land, trying for their way of life and their culture and everything else to survive. It is an extraordinary heroic story, and that is a story that we must teach about the frontier wars. I'll stop there because I want us to have a discussion and comment, so that is where I am.
Draws breath. I'll do a little bit of the introduction for the next bit. This should hopefully come on in a moment. There's no pressure. Excellent, it's on. Okay, be careful what you say. The way we're going to do the Q&A section for the next part, largely Henry's going to moderate it and I'll steer where it needs to. The travelling mic will struggle a little bit around the room, but I would imagine most of us are teachers, so we'll use our sort of schoolroom voices and make sure everyone can hear, and hopefully also make sure it's picked up by the video. My own personal perspective is that the journey to reconciliation probably doesn't need, particularly my white male middle-aged voice dominating this space too much. So talking to representatives of Murray Ministries who are here today, who've got a close relationship with the school, the suggestion was that we have Indigenous voice and female Indigenous voice entering into the conversation. So as the Q&A is happening, we're going to steer it from time to time to Kerry Klim, and Henry, if you can steer to Kerry as well. Oh, and Rabina's back in play. Okay, excellent. I was going to say why Kerry, and Kerry was saying exactly the same thing, and I think was pointing a little bit at Rabina. So there'll be two voices there, and Rabina, forgive me, I'm going to do a little bit of background on who Kerry is, and you might do a little bit yourself later on. Kerry is of the Kuku-Yalanji people who are up in the Daintree region of North Queensland. She's also connected to the Coco Lama Lama people, and they are of Eastern Cape, York. She's a journalist. She works or worked with Win TV, ABC, Imparta in Alice Springs, and also the National Indigenous Radio Service. So her brief is to add her perspectives, her voice into here. Henry clearly is the historian's voice here. Henry brings something different. Rabina, it's been a while, so I'm not even going to attempt to do the same intro, but I do know you with National Indigenous TV for a while. Do you want to say very quickly a little bit about your voice without, you don't have to jump up and say a little bit about yourself, sorry.
Yeah, we want to see you.
Oh, they want to see you.
Yeah.
Kerry, you might stand up as well. It's not quite on plan now. But Kerry is on the left, Rabina is on the right.
Actually, Rabina's on the left. No pressure, but I wasn't with National Indigenous Television, I was with National Indigenous Radio Service. Kerry Klim was the inaugural journalist. We had a wonderful 2 years. We had a satellite footprint out of Fortitude Valley that went Australia-wide. I joined Kerry. 2 more Indigenous journalists joined Kerry in 2001. My life before that, because I'm a little few years older than Kerry, was I'm a Gurang woman from Port Curtis Coral Coast, so that's Gladstone to Bundaberg, and you go west to many peaks, you go out to Croomba Tops, etc., etc. So whilst I say who I am, how dare I forget to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay them respect and honour for allowing us to walk, talk and gather in their traditional hunting grounds. Back to myself, and I won't tell you everything about myself, so why should I? I've got to keep some personal things personal. But my life began as a professional life as a teacher. I had opportunity, and as a teacher because a gentleman by the name of Gough Whitlam allowed me to get an education. After that, someone else allowed me to go to the ABC and begin working there as a reporter and a presenter. Later on, I was allowed to go to the ABC to be involved in employment and recruitment for Indigenous Australians, Australia-wide, and corporate radio and television. And then I went to radio news with Kerry. What else did I do?
I think that's all nice. Kerry, do you want to say a little bit about yourself as well? I think we're going to play. It is definitely on. I think it feels like it's on.
Yep. Yeah, so Yundu Yalda, which is hello in Kuki-Yalanji language. And fortunately, after it has been lost in our family for, I would say, 110 years, when my grandmother was stolen, removed from her country as a 5-year-old. My great-grandmother had gone into hospital she was pregnant to have her baby at Port Douglas Hospital. And while she was in hospital, she never returned. And the policeman came and took my grandmother and my great-aunt. My grandmother was 5, my great-aunt was 7, and put them on the train. Told them that their mother had died in hospital. We're not sure. That's what they were told. There is no records, and put them on a train and sent them to Yarrabah Mission, where they grew up in the dormitories, and my grandmother met my grandfather, who was Kuki-Yalanji, and he had been removed as a child. And his mother had actually followed him as the troopers took him down. She secretly followed the troopers so she could remain with her only boy, her only son, and they married. So yes, Yundu Yalanda, there's an app, can you believe it? This is the amazing thing with technology these days. Me and my children are learning to speak our language again, which is exciting. What I wanted to sort of share, and I'm like, why have I been brought here today? What can I contribute? And what did I sort of get out of it? And I sort of thought, the first thing I thought was, what an incredible journey of 50 years, starting here, of truth-telling in books. Truth-telling in books, not in spoken language. Truth-telling continues. It has never been lost. The truth-telling never lost with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's truth-telling in books that the journey has begun. 50 years. The other thing I thought of was that phrase, the Great Australian Silence, 1968, the Great Australian Silence. It hasn't ended. The Great Australian Silence has not ended. The silence is still there. And I want to share with you an experience of something that happened last year. My boy, he was 8, goes to a state school in Northside, and I talked to him about our family and our culture, because we don't live on our land, but we return. And he came home very excited with one day, and he said, Mum, I've got a book on Aboriginal people, I'm going to show you. He was so excited to show me. And I looked at the cover and I had a really deep, sunken feeling, and I just knew just by the cover. It was a photograph of an Aboriginal man in headdress. I just knew it wasn't going to be good. And I opened it up and I started to look at some of the content. I'll read you 2 phrases that came out of it. I won't tell you the year that it was published yet, I'll leave that at the end. Maybe I'll do a guessing game, see when you think this book might have been published. 1, it said, many Aboriginal prisoners commit suicide while being held by the police. No one is sure why. Possibly because many Aborigines have drunk too much alcohol. That was one entry. Another entry, many Aborigines are poor and jobless. Poor people are jobless, sometimes turn to crime to escape boredom. These were just 2 entries. There was many other entries that were upsetting. Anyone want to have a guess of when this was published, this book? Anyone? Hands up. Anyone?
2000.
2000s. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, since the death and custody inquiry, perhaps.
So I'll
That's
get
30 odd years, isn't it? Yeah.
So it was published in 1992. 1992. I was just shocked. So I was very upset. My son was upset. He was so excited to bring this book home, and I just said, oh, I'll go talk to the librarian and I'll return the book for you. I didn't want to tell him what was in it. He hadn't read it yet. I didn't want to tell him what was in it. I didn't want to have to then explain. I just wanted to save that for another time. So I went to the library and I showed the librarian and the assistant at the time, and she said, oh, the librarian's not here. She said, come back when the librarian's here. So I came back and I came back and I kept missing the librarian. And I thought, can't you just make a time to meet? This is really important. So eventually we sat together and we talked about it, and I said to her, how many other books are like this in this library? She said, oh, I don't know. Could be, who knows? And I said, well, that's just not good enough. You should know. It shouldn't be here in the first place. And she said, yes, you're right. And I said, look, I'll volunteer my time. I'll come here every Monday for a couple of hours, and you and I can sit together, and we're going to go through this library. You bring the books and we'll see what we find. And it took us 3 terms, and we did it every Monday, a couple of hours. And initially she was like, we'd open the book and she'd pass it on to me, and I'd look through it and I'd say, well, this content, no, not good enough, leave it out. This one's actually not a bad book, this looks good. And so we started doing that. And then I was like, no, this isn't my job, this is your job. So I eventually started to say, well, what do you think? After a period of a few weeks, because I didn't want to just leave that library and then what has she achieved? Okay, she's done the process, but had she learned anything? So I started to push it back on her, and I'd see what she thought, and together we made those decisions. And what was I going to say? There was something I was going to say. Together we made those decisions. And she said to me, and it came up many times, the teachers, they're too afraid. They don't want to make a mistake, And I was like, why have you not done this? Oh, I'm too afraid, I didn't want to make a mistake. And you know what the answer is? You've already made a mistake by doing nothing. By doing nothing, you've already made that mistake for us, because you're perpetuating the lies. You've kept those lies in those books in that library because you didn't want to make a mistake.
So, thanks, Kerry. Thanks for being here. So we'll have their perspectives coming in. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Kerry. I think Kerry has spoken for every Indigenous person in this room and every Indigenous person living in Brisbane, and you just keep that little ripple of water continuing. Thank you both, and thank you, Professor, for the wonderful words you had to say here today. But the truth-telling, what's the converse? Lies. So because truth-telling hasn't occurred to the extent that we like, I feel as though I'm a walking lie. And what does that do to the spirit? What does that do to a community? Truth-telling, the second time here, the conversation has begun. That's wonderful. There is a you and an I involved here. It's not just 2 letters in the alphabet, but it's also you, generally, the unknown. Are we the unknown? And the I, is it me? Where does the ignorance lie? Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. So I acknowledge absolute passion and wonderful input already. I guess the imperative is on us, largely as teachers, whether it's history teachers or other subjects connected to this. What we do matters. And that phrase stuck me. I saw that with the United States Holocaust Museum. It's part of their logo in Washington, DC. What you do matters. And I can only speculate at how deeply it matters. And I think we've just seen that now. The question and answers that you raise, one of the things I said to Henry in his brief is, really want to see how do we enhance what happens in the classroom. I think we've got 45 minutes of this conversation. How do we do our job better, and how do we carry that back? What should we say? How should we say it? And that's why we need also First Peoples' voice in there. So someone hopefully is brave enough. I'm hoping there are people champing at the bit, wanting to ask the first question. Henry, I'm going to retreat to the side again, and I'll let you choose. And I think, ladies, as you wish, chime in. I think Henry will respond and so forth, and sometimes it'll go to the keeper, and sometimes it'll be worth adding more, I think. I think that's the way we'll do it, and be fairly fluid. Our aim is to finish at 11 o'clock after about 45 minutes of Q&A. There will be an opportunity outside to buy bits and pieces. There'll be food arriving and so on for morning tea and network, and the conversation should continue amongst us then. Hopefully you're not all wanting to rush back to school on student friend. Okay, so over to you. I might suggest the first person. Someone wants to fire away. Gentleman in the middle, Henry Reynolds.
Guess I stand up. I don't. Professor Reynolds, it's wonderful to hear your voice. Just wanted to say, well, my name's Glenn Davis. I'm from Crazy State High, and I had a great privilege. You won't remember this, but I was in your Australian history unit in 1986. I'm from one of those small country towns in North Queensland. I'm a Charter Stowers boy. So your voice hasn't changed. Very pleased to hear that. But one thing I noted right towards the end was your comment about the Crown and the monarchy. And with the removal of the Crown and the monarchy, obviously the injustices become very stark. And in a way, perhaps are even easier to address. Would that then mean removal of the Crown and the monarchy, becoming a republic, is something that you'd support?
Oh, well, I support it, whatever. I mean, I don't believe in hereditary aristocracy. And I don't see how you can be a Democrat and believe in hereditary aristocracy, which is what the monarchy is. So, yes, but I do think, as I say, we see it most critically in the battle about Australia Day. That is one of the key points of the culture wars at the moment. And what I call them the Anglo-Australians, and there are still a lot of them, the Anglo-Australians want to do it because they say that was the beginning of our British heritage. But there's so much wrong with that. I mean, the British heritage, was where everyone who came to New South Wales or Van Diemen's Land in this early way came as exiles, convicts who were being sent to the far side of the earth because they'd stolen things. 90% stolen things. And they were separated from their home, their country, their families, everything else. They were suddenly picked up and thrust to the far side of the world. Now, that's the thing I don't think we should in any way commemorate in saying that that's where it began. But more importantly, when the British, it's not that the British just that they arrived, it's the way they arrived. They arrived with convicts. But they arrived with the idea and the law that the whole of Eastern Australia became British, and all the property became the property of the Crown. Now that was an extraordinary, and it was totally foreign to the international law of the time, and it was even more foreign to British law, because the Crown can't just take people's property. But they did. And this was done in Britain in 1786 by people who had never been here. And that became the law. Now, how can you possibly want to commemorate that? It's just that people don't know their history as much as anything else. And they think this is wacky-doo, will wave the Union Jack and say that's when we became British. Well, it was an appalling process of colonisation. That is, that the First Nations people had no right to their own land, and that wasn't changed until 1992. And they still haven't changed the idea that everyone in the whole of Eastern Australia lost their right to govern over their own land, their sovereignty. And that is still the law. But it's the law because that's what the British decided to do, because of the advice they've been given by people on Cook's expedition. Particularly Joseph Banks said, and he's the great aristocrat, you know, a botanist, he'd been with Cook, he'd been in Botany Bay, you know. And he, when they were discussing where will we send the convicts, now we can't send them to America, he said, well, in Botany Bay, there are very small numbers of people who will almost certainly move aside, abandon their country when we arrive, and the rest of the continent is uninhabited. So they felt, oh, we'll say, because you know, there's no ownership, so we'll become the first owner, and there's no government, there's no laws, so we'll be the first sovereigns. Now, we still live under that, and that started when, specifically, when Philip stood up on the 7th of February and read out his proclamations. Now, why ever on earth would you want to make that your national day? But how do you explain, how do you get that over? It isn't just that it's, you know, clearly the people who are most concerned are the First Nations people, but every Australian should be outraged about it. Every Australian should be outraged that these people on the far side of the world made these decisions which had such tragic consequences. So yes, as I say, there are these points, but clearly the conservative Australians will die in a ditch to defend 26th of January. And you can't see any resolution of that for a long time. You know, they see it as a, you know, they're not going to be pushed around by these troublemakers. We're going to stand up for our British heritage. But whatever was good about the British heritage, it wasn't what arrived in 1788. I wondered, is that a specific answer to your question, or is there more that I should say?
Who am I to... but a great answer, but not that I wanted to get into the talk about referendums at all, but it was that comment you did make towards the end about if the Crown was not there, then we as a nation would have to address the issues that became starkly more obvious, perhaps more quickly.
Yes. Well, you see, one of the, you know, I'm now living and, you know, working on Tasmanian history, working on new curriculum, and also, you know, writing stuff. Now, one of the problems is that in most Australian, ordinary Australian, mainstream Australians get terribly defensive, and they feel guilty. Now, that's partly because they, you know, history has to discriminate. And above all, you've got to, as I say, you've got to see that so much of what went wrong with the way the British did it. And because they acted in ignorance or acted in deep prejudice about what they called savages. And they didn't do what was common in North America. Now, one of the things that I say again and again and again is just compare Queensland with Canada. Now, when Queensland was being occupied, invaded, settled, you know, from 1860 right up until the early 20th century, Canada was also settling the Great Prairies from the Great Lakes to the Rockies. Similar huge area, same sort of British colonial government, same law, same sort of people. And yet that settlement of the Western Plains was done without violence. It was done because they signed treaties. They're called the numbered treaties. And right across the prairies are the numbered treaties. Now, in many ways, the Indians lost control of much of their land, but not all of it. And it was done by making treaties. But you could make treaties because they were still regarded as having sovereignty. So if you've got sovereignty and land ownership, you've got something to sit down at the table with and negotiate. Just as Waitangi. It's the same story. But if you say there's no sovereignty there, you don't have to do anything. You can just roll across the country because there's an absence. There's an absence of property and an absence of sovereignty. So the violence in Queensland must be related to the way in which the British decided to settle Australia, and they changed their mind after. I mean, largely because of what happened in Tasmania, they realised you had to go back to treaties and recognition of property rights, as they did in New Zealand, and as they did then in Fiji and right across the Pacific. They went back to the old way of doing things. Australia was a terrible mistake. So, you know, that's in so many ways why the link with Britain. We should, if you want the link with Britain, be honest about the disaster that they brought on Australia. And there's no other way you can explain it. And as I say, one of the first things, when we get around in a few months doing what New Zealand is doing now about Cook, we'll say, yes, well, that's all very well. He was a very famous navigator. But let's use that the occasion to tell the British, well, it's time you now gave the apology and let's talk about reparations. Now they'll say, no, we didn't give you any money. Well, all right, let's negotiate about it, because the way the British decided to settle Australia was a disaster. And I can't find, you know, I put my mind to thinking, how can you defend this if you want to? I can't think of a way you can defend it, except say, oh, they made a mistake. But we didn't know they owned the land. Well, no poor convict ever was released by saying, I didn't know the property was belonged to someone else. You know, it's not a defence. It was justifiable at the time. You know, the hypocrisy of a country that made the defence of property the centre of their law. Property was more important than life itself. I mean, convicts, not only were they being transported for 7, 14 years for property theft, but they were being hung for theft in Australia. They were being hung for stealing a sheep, even being found with a sheepskin, indication of sheep theft. They were being hung in the early convict years. Now, a society that put so much emphasis on the sanctity of private property had taken the property of people over half a continent. You know, it is astonishing. I mean, it's the same sort of hypocrisy, but the Americans and, you know, the Constitution, right to freedom, liberty and pursuit of happiness, all men are born equal. Well, this was all done by the slave owners. Now, the Americans faced up to that hypocrisy. We haven't faced up to the hypocrisy of a society that, above all, said the rule of law is above all the protection of property, while simply expropriating the largest area of property. I think the only comparable thing is when Lenin expropriated everyone in the Soviet Union, early Soviet Union in 1917. He said private property is here, it's abolished. Well, that's what the British said in 1788. The First Nations property is hereby abolished. We don't like to think of it that way. Anyway, that's time to move on.
Thank you.
Henry, have something fast up?
Yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering, so you kind of mentioned US experience, and there's been a discussion in US historical discourse around Plains Indians and the Indigenous American population, and it's been referred to often increasingly as a genocide. I wondered how you felt about the application of that word to the Australian experience, considering your discussion around was it murder, was it war? I wonder how you see genocide fitting into that.
Genocide, well, the problem with genocide is that it depends whether you want to just use it as a generic term. Like, I accept genocidal as a generic term, but genocide can only exist by its definition in the Genocide Convention, because the word didn't exist, the word had only been created in 1944. So it wasn't a word that had accreted all sorts of meaning. It was a very specific meaning, and then it was put into a legal convention. Now, if you apply the Genocide Convention, then, and two things. One, it's got to be murder rather than manslaughter. And two, you've got to prove the intention to commit race murder or people murder. And that's why genocide in the international criminal courts is really, it's crimes against humanity. It's much easier to prove than genocide. You've got to prove genocide's got to be done by someone. Who did it? That's the problem. And can you prove beyond reasonable doubt that they did it and they intended it? Or was it like manslaughter? It just happened as a consequence. So no one says the Americans would determine we're going to have genocide in Japan by dropping 2 atomic bombs. So genocide is I think, I wrote a book about it, but it's a difficult thing. If you start with the Genocide Convention, then it's a difficult thing to establish. And in Australia, see, the intention to destroy a people, well, which people are you talking about? You see, that's the problem. Because we can't go on just on the Aborigines. Now, there were certainly some places where I suspect the settlers and the native police were determined to exterminate a particular nation of one of the First Nations. But having done that, they didn't want to go killing people anywhere else. So there were little genocides, I'm quite sure, but it's a very sort of crude term to try and use over the whole of Australia. And it's most commonly used about Tasmania, and there are books written about it, but I don't agree. Partly, we have to know what happened and why. The definition you use, I think it's a second or third rate question. So as I say, I don't mind people saying it is genocidal, because that then becomes an adjective which can be more generic than genocide itself, which is a legal, very precise legal concept. You see, in the war crime trials in Nuremberg, after the Genocide Convention, I was still trying the Nazis, they didn't use genocide because of the difficulty of establishing where is the paper trail which shows the specific intention. And even the Holocaust is difficult to pin down the specific intention. And you've got to prove it beyond reasonable doubt, because it's like a murder trial. So yes, I think about it a lot and talk about it quite a bit. But as I say, it's more complex than it seems.
Hi, I'm Michael Vine from Miami State High School. We're on Kumari land on the Gold Coast, speakers of the Yugambeh language. Going to be a bit greedy. I've got 2 questions, one to Henry and one to Kerry and Ravina. It's about truth-telling, and at Miami we do a Year 7 unit, which is a what you call a non-deficit unit about culture, the local culture of Kumari people. We also have a senior Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander class, and goes from grade 10 to grade 12. One of only 6 in Queensland, I think. And for me, as Head of Humanities, when regarding truth-telling and fitting it into the curriculum, my question for you, Henry, is, should we concentrate on things like Griffith's complicity with the work of his henchmen, like Frederick Wheeler, and Do you know anything about Wheeler's whereabouts and how he got away with what he did? Was it all about his, you know, friends in high places?
Yeah, they certainly carried money and said, go. And so he left the colony, and then he ended up somewhere in Java or somewhere like that. I mean, that is known. Yes, of course that's a real problem. I think these things are just important events, so they need to be talked about. But when we don't know, we can't try and give a psychological explanation of someone, a killer like Wheeler, because we just don't know enough about him. Called the handsomest man in Queensland. It is a real problem with the teaching, a real problem. And as I say, the main thing is you don't want your students to, some of them will undoubtedly resist because they don't want to feel guilty. I mean, that's a critical thing, that you don't want to suggest that they're guilty, or that, what is the we talk about? Oh, we were so bad. Do we mean white people? Well, that's such a hopeless term in modern Australia. Do we mean the descendants of the British or the descendants of the convicts? Now, in Tasmania, where I have to deal with these things, if you look at the census of 1847, half the population are convicts or their descendants. A quarter of the population are native-born children, and only a quarter are free settlers. Now, if you want to sort of be discriminating, who has most moral responsibility for this? Well, yes, the free settlers, because they chose to come to Australia to start a new life, whether or not they understood what they were doing. But you can't sort of sheep the same home to the convicts. They had no choice in the matter. They didn't want to be here. And then what do you do about the native born? Well, each generation is born afresh. They need to know, but they can't, in a way, carry the guilt of earlier generations. So it becomes very complicated, and it seems to me that modern Australia now is so complicated. 40% of the population of cities is overseas born. The old Australians, includes the First Nations and the old colonial Australians, seem to me to have a great deal of history they share. And we're all in it together. Because so many of us have mixed descent. I've got some Aboriginal descent, although I didn't grow up Aboriginal, so I don't claim it. There are many, many First Nations people, clearly, who have European descent. Some of them know who their forebear was, and some don't. So it's, in a way, if we get away from this idea that you have to, the people have to understand but not feel guilty. And that's the critical thing. They understand and have empathy and a desire to bring contemporary justice, but you don't get, I mean, there were studies around the time of John Howard's statement, I think by Manning Clark's granddaughter, I forget her name, and did a great deal of work on teachers. Some of you will know that, and quite clearly this did trouble kids, and that makes the teaching that much more difficult. And that's why so many teachers are very worried and frightened they might do the wrong thing, like the librarian. There are inherent difficulties in this, and I appreciate that this is something which teachers are facing all the time. So, did you have another one?
Yeah, to Kerry and Ravina. I was listening to Kerry's story about the librarian, and the debate in our staff rooms is Should we be teaching more culture, Yugambeh culture, Kumaberi culture, non-deficit culture, or should we be doing more hardcore truth telling in the limited space that we've got in the curriculum? What's their opinion on that?
Why make it a choice?
Yeah, exactly.
You're a teacher, do your job. Teach everything, do the lot, don't choose. And as for feeling guilty today, a child born in 2000, okay, so they're going to be 19 years of age. Why do they have to be guilty about something that happened 315 years ago? That's a very bad excuse. We're not going to be putting guilt on people. Give them a few facts about timelines. They live to now. They live today. And me living alongside you, am I going to be invisible forever? Am I going to be someone's little lie? We're about truth telling here. You have a job, do it. I'm sorry if I sound so rude, but I am amazed at why we have these questions about, well, we can't do it because of this or we can't do it because of that. Yes, dear.
Is it so much about making them or them feeling guilty? It's them having to deal with this dilemma of being caught between those who believe one thing and those who want something else. So they have to deal with this dilemma. It's not about that they don't feel guilty. They think why, they ask why I'm not guilty.
I thought we were worried about people assuming a mantle of guilt. If they don't feel guilty, is there an issue? It's knowledge we're talking about.
But how do they deal with this dilemma? How do they deal in a certain, like their parents might believe one thing and talk something else in school. They go home, they talk to each other about this with their parents and their parents go, that's not right. What's your teacher talking about?
Can I chime in? I'm going to see that in a totally different space. I think that's the disruption we're talking about. I think as historians, and there are different voices, there's activist voices and so on, as historians we deal in, I think, and feel free to shoot me down later, but it's about evidence and supporting arguments and acknowledging different perspectives, but we go back to the evidence. And I had a science teacher say to me on the weekend at a conference about working the problem. The issue is that there are people who are not wanting to acknowledge the evidence.
But I want to know what they say.
Back to you before Henry.
Auntie, would you want to talk? I want to advertise.
I think obviously for me the issue is, as the library example shows, the library has all these books which is conflicting what's being taught or not taught in the classroom, which is being conflicted what the parents of whatever generations know and understand and telling their children, which is being conflicted with what's on television, and it is not, you know what I mean? Then there's this big mess obviously in the middle. So it's about the disruption and the guilt, and how do you fix that? Well, you've just got to, as back to the question about, this is not either or. This is about educating about Kumba Mary, about them, about the Torres Strait Islander people. It's bringing everything into that classroom, into your maths, into your science, into your geography. It's not about culture, you know. It's not about just having a didgeridoo play here and welcome us and then that's it, you know. It's not about welcome. I had a lady the other day ask me, a colleague, and say, oh, are we doing, is it like, do we do 4 acknowledgements now? Is that what we're doing, And I was just like, I just thought that was the strangest question. Like, it's not a black and white. It's what is so hard to be acknowledging the traditional owners? What is so hard to be wanting to be welcomed onto this country? What was so, it made it seem so difficult that every 4 speakers acknowledged. And I was astounded.
Can I just go back to what you said about the child then going home, and does that put them in contention with their parents? That is family business, but your business is providing a safe environment for children in your classroom. And that is both physiological, it is psychological, it's what you do. You are providing
But the problem that I wanted you to comment on is, what does the child, what are the skills that you have identified that the child needs that we need to teach, right? I just thought you may have had some
I
insight.
do have a view, and it's safety in knowledge, it's safety in their environment. You are providing an environment of nurturing. So too are the parents, and it's not your nurturing versus the nurturing of the parents, or their being in contention with their parents. You are creating a whole, you're not creating, you are nurturing a whole human being within your environment, which is the school education environment. You give them safety in that, you give them the skills to withstand, the skills to discuss, the skills to form an argument, the skills to respond, the skills to listen. You have the best environment available to you, and that is the schools and the universities. So you've got to allow individuals to be strong in themselves because they love their parents. Hopefully their parents love them. Give them the skills to be able to interact and interrelate with people.
I think, Auntie, you wanted to make a quick point, and we'll take another question back.
I work in the Protestant churches, or try to educate people in those denominations. But we're having a similar event 2 weeks' time at St Andrew's Anglican Church in South Brisbane. We run a lot of things over there and trying to educate people from the different denominations, particularly those within the Protestant churches. So we're looking at the history of this country. There'll be two clergy coming up from down south, and they're very much involved with some of our Aboriginal pastors. So if you're free and you'd like to come along to that evening, but one of the other important things is that we're trying to educate about the history of this country, which is hardly ever spoken about. And I want to thank you and your school for putting this on today. We'll certainly be challenging the other denominations. And they've got big schools in this city and in this state and in this country. We do things in Sydney and Melbourne too. And so we'll be challenging them to what you were saying about the history, as well as these two clergymen that's coming up, because this history belongs to you and to me. We've got to make it right in this nation, all of us, because most people have benefited what's happened to Aboriginal people. Now, I have a bit to do with Robina. We're going to talk about our ministries, and you've got no idea the things that we come up against in our communities. And only the other day, one of our other workers, church workers here in Brisbane, rang me up late in the evening because of something that happened in our community. And she told me that in the prison here in Brisbane, there's 400 Aboriginal women. Now that's shocking. That's shocking. We're running a seminar in Sydney a few months ago. And one of the other clergy, not the clergy, church lady, I once have a denomination, came up and said to me afterwards, well, I'm a chaplain at the prisons there in Sydney. And she said to me, well, why is it that Aboriginal women keep on coming back into prisons? And I said, well, you should be asking your denomination to look at the history of this country and not only depend upon us as Aboriginal people. You're part of the history of why those women are there in prison. So let's come together and let us look at this and work together so that we can bring it not only a better perspective, but much more healing into our nation. I think too many of us are too comfortable, Aboriginal people, non-Aboriginal people, and we go about our days and think, well, there's nothing wrong in this country. Well, we've heard some things today, and you'll continue to hear it from us and from Robina and Sister Kay there at the back. She's a good spokesman. We invite her to go and speak to, but thank you very much, Professor Reynolds. But remember, it's on the 8th of next month at St Andrew's Anglican Church in South Brisbane. Contact Robina or myself. If you
get the details to me, I'll email it out to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thinking in terms of time, time, I'm going to throw back to Henry here. I'm sure you've been listening and a few thoughts come to mind. Take a couple more questions. I am conscious of time. So, Henry, thoughts and...
Oh, no, I had wanted the floor for a long time. There must be questions. I mean, with such a bright, well-educated audience. Yeah. Yes. Yes, you. Big voice.
My question is, I'm teaching frontier violence and subsequent government policies at the moment with my Year 12s, and one of the things that came up in class the other week that stumped them was not guilt about the past, but despair about the future in terms of subsequence. You know, going through government policy, government after government, promising so much and delivering so little. They're coming to terms with the history and the frontier violence and quite willingly accepting, you know, that new truth, but then this generation's kind of despair as to, well, where do we go from here? When are we going to see real change? And the comment that was made before, a lot of them are thinking, well, why is it so hard to get this acknowledgement, get this constitutional reforms, those sorts of things moving forward? So I guess I was just going to ask about those perspectives.
No. Well, I mean, clearly the whole climate thing is so the same sort of feeling has driven, you know, my granddaughter, my 12-year-old granddaughter made her first public speech in the Hobart rally, and 20,000 people, you know, rallied, so many of them kids. And not overwhelmingly, but the leaders were girls, you know. This is astonishing. So there is that sense of this generation, legitimately, that really things like this, you know, the politics is now just so difficult to admire in any way, and there are so many difficulties to get things done that you know, I think it's good that they feel that way. Just tell them, you know, get out and be active. And you know, I think the way the Euler statement was treated was absolutely outrageous, utterly disrespectful, contemptuous, and I don't think that anyone's going to do much. And you know, where's change coming from? Unless it's going to be from this generation, who we certainly hope are going to be much more activist and get in and demand change. So yes, tell them that I said get active.
Yeah. Hi, I'm just getting back to, you mentioned before Anna Clark.
Yes, Anna.
And I listened recently to a keynote no speech at a history teachers conference we had, and she was talking about, you know, how we teach and coming back to the reference to, you know, it's evidence-based history. And she said, do we trust written or oral history more, and why is that? And she mentioned before it was written, it was told and sung by Indigenous Australians. How might we incorporate different history making into our teaching and learning? So I thought that was a really interesting question that she rhetorically posed to us, and I'd like to pose it to the three of you.
Well, quite clearly oral history, I mean, there's been a certain amount done, but one of the truth-telling questions indeed should be a properly nationally funded. I mean, if we gave the same seriousness to the Frontier Wars as we did to the First World War, there'd be a large national project, properly funded, properly run all over the country, recording. And that is essential. That must be part of the truth-telling. And as I say, it depends what priority you give to it. And the bizarre way in which we spend more on commemorating the First World War than any other country, which is astonishing. So that it's got to have that sort of level of priority, and serious collating making what oral history there is. I mean, I think the Institute in Canberra has got a lot of that, but coordinating what exists and finding what else needs to be done. And you know, some of that will be compelling, some of it won't be, some of it will be extremely important for understanding specific historical times and events, but it is there to be done. And that's one of the things which the truth-telling has to encompass.
May I just mention something, please? Who asked the question? My husband, Leslie George Anderson, served in the Vietnam War. In 2014, Professor Nick Dodson from ANU began a 4-year project, and that was to talk to and get the stories of Indigenous servicemen and women right around Australia. In 2016, he came out with, I suppose, the text, Serving Country, and last year, the next text, they're about this thick, if, you know, size means something, and this is Our Mob Served. Now, every state and territory in Australia, they found people to interview. People came forward. Lots of people were left off. You'd be surprised at the number of Indigenous men and women who served Australia, from the Boer War right through until what they've been doing or what they're doing now. Please, I beg your indulgence. Reading the story of those men and women, you get the stories of their families. You get the stories 3-4 generations back. So what we're getting truth-telling here, not just about going to war, but the circumstances people came from, what drove them to leave that home where they were placed, the institutions they came out of. Servicemen, or the services became their families. You get to hear and see the underlying stories about Indigenous Australians, simply about this story of serving country, this theme of serving country. And under duress and incredible circumstances, this is what Indigenous men and women did. But if you were to see the anecdotal stories in book form, you get to hear and see a lot of the history about Indigenous Australians, their lives, their families, Australia in those days, Australia at each period of those wars that Australians went to fight. Recordings, that's what happened. Money was spent, a 4-year project, to get those stories. And in fact, it would be great if you, I suppose, acquired those 2 texts, and I can give you the names of them to have in your libraries.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I always say, you know, we're good journalists because we're the original storytellers, you know, Aboriginal people. That's our art form, you know. We had to do it to survive for our culture. So we are experts storytellers, verbal storytellers. So there's so much recordings that haven't been accessed that need to money invested into utilising and accessing those, obviously with support and approval from the communities and the families. But I think there is absolutely hundreds of thousands of hours of recordings that will help Australia and build our history. And the other element, I would say, it's not just verbal, it's not just the written, it is the visual. We can look at another Murray down the street, probably only see half their face and we know almost where that mob's from. So we are very visual communicators, and that's also important as well when it comes to communicating and telling the stories.
And I might just throw in there before that question, if you're not aware, Lindley Wallace, archaeologist doing her Mounted Police Project, or the Queensland Native Police Project, it's a database launching at Queensland Museum in December, and part of the evidence she's got there is a whole stack of recordings of oral history. So keep an eye out for when she circulates more information there. Henry, I think there's a question I saw a movement of a hand there.
I hate public speaking, so I just want some help around. I'm a laboratory woman from New South Wales. Ladies at the front and Professor Reynolds. I really struggle with the word terminology, frontier wars. The reason from what you said earlier, you talk about it's actually murders, it's genocide, it's a number of different things. When we talk about the frontier, we're talking about the division between two countries, like it wasn't that in Australia. And all of this that happens We've got the new curriculum coming out, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. I really struggle with that as well. It should be Aboriginal, it should be Australian history, because it's actually, when we talk about guilt, it's actually a shared history. This isn't just a one-sided story that we're telling, and the truth needs to be told. So I'm struggling with those words, I'm just not sure. I just want your opinion on what you think about that, please.
Yeah, Frontier Wars, I mean, I'm not tied to it. And it is a, you raise an important question. See, if indeed there was nothing there, no sovereignty, then it isn't a frontier in that sense. But if you put that back, that indeed the settlers and their supporters and their troopers were moving out into the sovereign territory of the different nations, then there were many, many frontiers. So it is difficult, but it's one of those terms which is now so commonly used that...
especially when there's unarmed women and children, it's really, I struggle with the whole thing, yeah.
Well, that now happens in most wars that have been fought. In the 19th century, most people were killed with combatants. Now, most people who are killed are women and children and civilians. That is now a part of, absolute part of war, and in many ways it always has been. So, yes, as I say, I can see, there are problems about the term, but it's partly that question, was it war? Well, I think it is better for everyone to recognise it as the war of conquest for Australia.
Yeah.
And then, it doesn't become this situation that is not like anywhere else, where there was all this conflict but it wasn't war. What was it? What were the First Nations people? Were they bandits? Were they, why were they fighting if they weren't involved in a war? There was certainly conflict, but there's all sorts of conflict that isn't regarded as war. Crime, piracy, banditry, all of these things are sort of beneath the threshold of war. And that is exactly the sort of attitude that the War Memorial takes. Yes, of course there was fighting, but hasn't got the dignity of war.
Yeah, it's like resistance.
So, yes, but now you've had a question, I think, another question, didn't you?
Yeah, just about talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies and the history that we're talking about. I think it's a shared history. It should be Australia's history. It's a shared history. I'm not sure. I just wanted some thoughts on that.
Did you want to comment on that?
Oh, are you talking about the nations, individual nations? Oh, sorry, Rabina and I just had a quick chat.
Reuben was so happy to see it.
Sorry?
Reuben was so happy to see it in that little book.
Yeah, so Rabina was just saying, my son bringing home the Aboriginal book and so excited to see it. But we're talking now as in not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. We are really more talking about Meanjin, Jagera and Turrbal and Butchulla, and we're actually wanting to change that conversation. We're not wanting to be tied to this, firstly, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander title, and secondly, we don't want to be that add-on. That's what we've always been through history. It's like you say, Australian curriculum, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies. And we're always that add-on. It doesn't matter what department you go to, government, school, and I don't know the answer, but it is an important question. To stop us being seen as the add-on. We are one nation, this is our history. But it's not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history. This is 150 nations history, yeah.
So we don't lose the terminology. You're introduced to 250 plus more words, and that's the name of each nation. And of course, that's a very long title for a book, isn't it? But you've got to work it in somewhere.
I might, just conscious of all the time, I'll throw to Marie, maybe then some closing remarks from Henry, since you've travelled a fair distance to be with us today. And looking to wrap up in about 10 minutes, probably from now in terms of time, if you're thinking about it, you've got to go.
A point and a question.
I think you'll have to speak.
Sorry, it must have been about 8 years ago at this school. became aware of students using language in a way that was not really appropriate for writing, speaking, even showing images to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island studies. And it was in English. And we invited David Miller and Ravina Waldron in and really had a big conversation about how we use words, how we use language. And it worked so well because it was an education not just for the students but for the teachers too, in terms of how we use it. And we really in the end came to the word respectful. How do we use language and teach our students and our staff to use language in a way that's respectful, rather than sometimes writing Australians and Aboriginals, for example, you know, which is terrible. But they were doing it, and I think that's a slow process. So I'd just like your comments on the notion that using language respectfully, is that an important part of what we do as educators?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in a way, we are still retreating from, two streams, powerful streams in Western thought. One, the idea there were distinct races who were arranged hierarchically. Now, those views were still powerful when I was growing up. So the idea, the idea of race was so important, and in a way, there's a resurgence. The other is the hierarchy of savagery and rising up to modern white people. Now, they were enormously powerful ideas, and so the residue of them still remains. And there's no doubt that the idea of white nationalism, white race nationalism, is resurgent. Certainly in Europe, certainly in North America. And so, indeed, respect is critically important, but you also have to appreciate that the lack of respect goes back to very deep trends in Western thinking. So that, this is just a manifestation of a much deeper, that's so deeply rooted. The other thing I think that some of the comments, one of the things I think that has had most effect on me is the new understanding of country and the land. Now, in particular, the book that influenced me most, and the person was Bill Gammage. Now, travelling across the country with Bill Gammage is extraordinary because he can see the country historically. So that it totally transforms your idea of the making of the country, but also the history of the country. And the marks, the shaping done by First Nations people is still on the land. And as we know, that now becomes critically important because we realise that what has been done since settlement has had terrible consequences. So I think the idea of sharing the land is the one which is most important, and it is the one, as I say, remember we're going to have maybe half the population of overseas recent arrivals. And that's may profoundly affect the way Australia develops. And they have to be inducted into the history of Australia, even if they resist and say, well, we're not interested. But above all, what brings it all together is the history of the land, of country. And that's something which, as I say, is profoundly important. And people are astonished to realise that what they thought was just nature, as God made it, is absolutely man-made. It is artefact, it's not. The whole Australian flora and fauna is shaped and created. And that's, I think, one of the most important things, and one of the best ways to begin the story. Look around and what you think of. And I mean, there are so many, in a way, this is one of the things where the Greens went wrong, saying, oh, these pristine landscapes, wilderness, but they're not. They're not at all. They were actually consciously made and with intelligent management of country. The idea that the Aborigines didn't touch the country, they just left it as they found it, was just silly. So I think country and the way in which we increasingly can understand the history of the land itself is probably among the most important unifying things we have.
I'd like to give a comment.
But you're a sprightly young chap. You stand up. Go on.
I am terrible with public speaking.
Well, you won't be worth standing up. Just
yes, I stick out like a sore thumb. There were several questions earlier regarding the teaching of history and the effects that it can have on students. Now I'm 21 years old, I've been out of school for about 4 years, so I was in school not too long ago. And I guess, forgive me, I'm not very good at talking. I'll try to summarise as quickly as possible. I guess I'd like to give you something to think about by offering you a glimpse of my person growing up, right? When I was in the 5th grade, we watched a documentary about how Indigenous peoples were mistreated in New South Wales. Particularly, you might recall the incident with the Indigenous children not being allowed to go into the swimming pool. And I came home that day. And I said, you know, to my mother, I'm upset about being white. I feel a sense of shame for that. And she was really good. She, said, well, you shouldn't, because what happened a long time ago has nothing to do with you. There is a great disparity between, well, how old was I, like 10, and the person that I was when I was 15. Now, the education system in Australia is fundamentally flawed. We don't teach history in the junior years. We don't teach it until high school. It's called HAS or some bullshit like that. I think Stuart McKinnon pointed out in 2009 that even HAS, which is only partially historically related, takes up 4% of the teaching time throughout the entirety of the school year. So I didn't get into history until high school. Now, by the time I was 15, I argued with my history teacher that the term Jap was not offensive because it was just a contraction of the word Japanese, and Japanese people shouldn't be offended about that. I argued the same thing about the word Abo. It's just a contraction, blah, 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 blah. Why are people offended? I argued that asylum seekers were wealthy people from the Middle East who were skipping the queue trying to get into Australia because they could afford to pay criminals to smuggle them to Indonesia, right? How did I go from point A to point B? Well, someone around the back said, well, you go home and you have, this sort of education might put children into conflict with their family. And it did for me. My father was a prison officer for 15 years. Now, when the reports came out about the Dundale Detention Centre, he very passionately proclaimed that it was dodgy journalism, that most Indigenous children are criminals by that age, and I believe I should quote him when he said, do you know how many times you have to get arrested to be sent to a detention centre? In other words, it was their fault, right? He then said, all of the footage of prison officers abusing Indigenous children was justified because they are, quote, animals. They throw their shit and their piss at police officers, prison officers, sorry. They deserve a good beating. Now, I didn't grow up with my father. He lived in New South Wales. I grew up in Logan. But like all boys, I put him on a pedestal and I absorbed his views. How easy do you think it was for me to do that and fall into that trap without skills of critical thinking, critical inquiry, or even just bottom line perspectivism or empathic thinking? Those sorts of things, that is why we have history. It's actually not in Australia. History was implemented in the 1920s to give a sense of patriotism to the youth, so it's actually a political tool in this country. But more broadly, today, that's why we should have history, right? I didn't get a very good history education, as you can see, and it wasn't until after I graduated high school that I had a sort of spiritual awakening. But the bottom line is, I should have been brought into conflict with my father, and I should not have idolised him. He is not a good man. I shouldn't have wanted to be like him, but I didn't know any better. Right? The bottom line is, I suppose, and I think I can speak for a lot of your students, is I would rather have known. Because I now have to think about how, whenever I reflect on myself in my high school years, I never particularly had a racist bone in my body, but I had plenty of Indigenous friends who I would make fun of them. I would make them feel guilty for pursuing any of the educational programs that they had to try to bring a balance of equity. And I now I've made it my own job to make amends for that. But you can stop your students from going the same path I went by just telling them the truth. All right, I part the
I am conscious of time, and I'm actually really conscious. Thank you for the honesty and the rawness of that. As I'm standing there hearing the voice of a young person, I'm really conscious, guys down the back. We do a lot of talk about student voice, and I didn't do that. So in future, we'll also ask students to be here, and some students to have voice in there. Look, I think it is time to tie things up quickly, and I'll throw to Simon in a moment. But while I was there, I was thinking, how do I bring this together as I try to get my phone to rotate properly? I'm supposed to start functions at all Hallows as customary, as part of our ethos, as part of our charism with the prayer. But me being me, I don't go prayer unless it sort of connects in the moment and so forth and spirit. And we're very ecumenical here as a group. We come from all different traditions and so on. But from our tradition, I'll throw you this one. It might be familiar to you. Make us instruments of peace. I didn't think I was going to get emotional, but okay. Where there's hatred, let us sow love. Where there's injury, pardon. Where there's discord, union. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there's darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. So the information we work with our kids as history teachers, the skills we work with, is challenging, and it's not meant to be comfortable. The past isn't even past. We live it. It's there. And I'm saying we live it as regardless of which part of the Australian community you're part of. It's my family story. It's everyone's family story. We're all in this together. And I think we need, as communities, to lead our kids on a challenging journey. And we need to do it in the right way. And I guess the starting point for that is the conversation. It's the challenge, it's the exchange, it's the feeling uncomfortable in your chair, it's the wondering where this is going. And I think we need the voices of people like Professor Henry Reynolds. I suspect a lot of this conversation wouldn't even happen if it wasn't for this guy sitting here, starting to write, think, ask questions over a brown paper baked potato sandwich. Okay, Archie Roach from Little Things, Big Things Grow. Wow. That's an interesting lunch you must have had with Eddie that day. Where that is. Okay, so I am going to throw to Simon Corvin, who's our Head of Teaching, Learning and Professional Practice in a moment. But from me, could I ask you all to give a huge round of applause to Jeremy, please?
Just before I thank Henry and all of our guests, Vince has done an incredible amount of work in the background. All of you would have seen the amount of work it's taken to put this together. Can we just very quickly thank you? I'm conscious of time, so we'll keep things brief. Thank you so much to our guests today. Thank you to all of you for coming along. I think it speaks to the calibre of the kind of presenter that we are, that we have students here on a student-free day who have turned up. I've got a whole bunch of my modern history students in the back, so thanks guys for coming along. And we grapple with these kinds of things all the time, and I think it's really important to get the words of someone like Henry Reynolds, so that when we go back to our classrooms, when we speak to people, we have the kind of knowledge now that we can add to that story. And I know I'll actually teach modern history next year to the year 11s if I have them next year, just from hearing the voices in this room today, which I think is important. So one last time before we head out to morning tea, and then hopefully you'll stay around and have conversations. Thank you so much for presenting.